Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Salem. I'm the Vice President for Policy and Research at the Middle East Institute. And I'd like to welcome you all to this panel discussion on Turkey's upcoming referendum, which is due to take place this Sunday. Undoubtedly, Turkey has faced a stream of shocks and developments in the last few years. The collapse of its no problems with neighbors policy seems like ancient history now. The war next door in Syria, radicalization, refugees, the rise of the PKK and the breakdown of the peace process there, all the way to the coup or the failed coup of July and the strong aftermath after that. Turkish voters this Sunday will face a referendum to shift to a presidential system or not. And if it passes, it would further empower President Erdogan. And whether the president succeeds in his long-sought consolidation of authority or suffers a reversal, Turkish policies on many issues will be very much affected: on economic policy, on domestic politics, dynamics, the Kurdish question, Syria policy, regional cooperation, regional security, engagement with the US and NATO, and many other issues. We're very pleased, first of all, to have our colleague Gönül Tol back. She was on maternity leave, and she and one of our other panelists, Omar Tashbinar, had a baby boy. So congratulations to them. And Gönül timed it perfectly to dovetail with the referendum and all of that, so it shows great foresight. This event is being live streamed. We also have a couple of TV stations covering it, but we will be live streaming it. So keep your phones on silent if you could. We do encourage tweeting. Please use hashtag MEI Turkish referendum if you're tweeting. Also, as many of you know, Gönül runs a rich Turkey program and has for many years here. So please visit our website for updates, articles, analyses, the occasional video as well, to keep up on Turkish affairs on that web page. Of course, visit the MEI website for many other things as well. We have an excellent panel assembled. Gönül will introduce them, as well as introduce the topic and run this panel. And Gönül, thanks for doing that. And please join me in welcoming Gönül and the panel.
Thank you, Paul, for the introduction, and I'm glad you mentioned our 3-month-old son, because if Ömer and I sound more pessimistic than usual, it's because we are sleep deprived. Although he got 5 hours of sleep last night, I didn't. And it's great to be back. So can we have this short video, if we can rerun it, so this could be our introduction to today's topic. And here you see the video ends on what many would consider a pessimistic note. And one might argue that that's what you see if you look at Turkey from Washington or European capitals. But if you look at Turkey from a central Anatolian town like Kayseri or Konya, which is an AKP stronghold or an MHP stronghold, you might get a completely different view. People might argue that, in fact, if passes, that Turkey could become a better place, that the economy would perform better, and the government might handle the pressing issues like terrorism, instability better. So no matter where you stand on the referendum, I think one thing is clear, and that is Sunday's vote will bring about, I think, the most important political development since 1923. And as Paul mentioned, it will have implications for Turkish economy, for Turkey's domestic politics, for Turkey's foreign relations. And we have a great panel to address these And let me introduce our panelists. I'm not going to go into the detail. You have their bios. We have, to my right, we have Ömer Taşpınar. He's a non-resident fellow at the Brookings, and he's a professor at National War College. And to his right, Kemal Kirişçi. He's the TÜSİAD Senior Fellow, and he's the director of the Center on the US and Europe's Turkey project at Brookings. To his right is my dear friend Amberin Zaman. He's a public policy fellow in the Middle East and Global Europe programs at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and she's also columnist for El Monitor's Turkey Pulse. So to kick off the discussion, I want to start, we know there have been several polls, public opinion polls, but it looks like it's going to be a tight race. So I want to get your take on, I want to hear about your predictions for Sunday's vote.
Ladies first.
Okay, Amberin, you go first.
I'm bracing myself for the worst and hoping for the best.
Well,
That doesn't count.
Doesn't give away my point of view, right?
I think I'll second that one. Okay, that leaves me as the only one who will say something. Normally, it should be a yes vote, and under normal circumstances, one would expect a yes vote because there's state of emergency. The opposition has not been able to really campaign. Yet the fact that it's too close to call, according to many opinion polls, is very telling. My hunch is that for it to be a no, the no has to be at least by 3-4% margin. So if it's a no, and my instincts say it may be a no against all odds, but if it's a no, it will have to be a 53-54% no, because if it's too close to call, this election could be rigged. It could be rigged in the sense that I think for the first time we're at a period in Turkish history where elections, we always argued that elections were free and fair in Turkey. It's clear that this election is not fair. The media situation, human rights situation, emergency law, freedom of speech. But it may also be one of the unprecedented occasions where it will not be free, in the sense that if it's really close, as it happened in the local elections in 2014 in Ankara, the safety of the ballot box and the tally, the voting may have some shenanigans. So I'm concerned about some irregularities. It's easier to to rig an election when it's very, very close, when it's just by 1%, 0.5. It's harder in a country like Turkey, where there will, despite everything, be foreign monitors, Western monitors, OSCE monitors, Turkish civil society. It will be harder to steal it, to rig it, if it's 3-4% margin. So I hope it will be a 3-4% margin, and that my instincts tell me that it could easily be a no vote.
But even the fact that it's going to be a close race, I think that is significant, because even just last year, I remember the overwhelming majority of Turkish public opinion was against switching to a presidential system. So how could Erdogan manage to turn things around, considering the state of Turkish democracy, economy, and the other problems that Turkey is facing?
There's a very good study that has just come out from a very good friend and colleague of ours, Ali Çarkoğlu, was published only a couple of weeks ago, based on exceptionally strong public opinion surveys and panel surveys, meaning that before the June 2015 elections, they went to surveyed a group of people. They surveyed the same people after the election, as well as after the second election, and then ran a standard public opinion survey. What's coming out of it is the frightfully the frightful lack of knowledge about what this referendum entails in terms of its details, the actual amendments. Frequent references are made that this is a system that is going to resemble the French one or the American one. And when the people who are surveyed are asked, I don't have the exact figures, but the ones who indicate some familiarity with those systems is extremely low, like 10, 12%. That's one observation the article makes. The second one is the skillful way in which the current president of Turkey has manipulated politics and won over MHP supporters. MHP supporters voted for their own party in the June 2015 election, but defected to AKP in the second one in November 2015, as Erdogan took an increasingly Turkish nationalist and anti-Kurdish position there. Although the indications are now that MHP is very split. So in a nutshell, time is very limited. I think there is a lot to be said. The electoral mathematical and strategist mind behind the person who is pursuing this particular referendum, and he has brought an important chunk of the Turkish electorate behind him. And we must not also forget that just about since Gezi Parkı, his politics is based on polarizing the country. So the country is split. Gönül made references to Anatolian towns. I will reflect on those towns and how they are doing economically when you get down to it. And then the others in the more western coastal areas, etc. So he has a solid base.
And his messaging, I think, has been extremely effective. He controls all the sort of propaganda tools. I mean, the media is mostly controlled, 90% controlled, some would say, by the AKP. And he's been very effective in framing this as a choice between stability, patriotism versus treachery.
Piousness.
That too, but above all, treachery and chaos. And yes, he does instrumentalize Islam. It's, you know, very clear that he's also sending a very clear message that if he fails, then the old elites will be back to business, tearing people's headscarves off, sort of cracking down on any displays of overt piety. He certainly has been sending that message too. But I think when we are having these conversations, we tend to overemphasize the importance of democracy, and that may shock you that I put it that way. But for ordinary Turks, you know, who are taking a bus from the back of beyond to their job like 2-3 hours away, the quality of the buses, of municipal services, of all these things matter immensely in ways that people like us who, you know, sit in the comfort of our offices and only occasionally dip into that universe can grasp, fully understand. And I think still today, if Mr. Erdogan is vaunting his past record of construction, bridges, all of that, it's because he understands that that really is what matters to people. And of course, the opposition is absolutely pathetic. They've been hopeless in their own messaging. And the only person who could have been truly effective as a counter, is Selahattin Demirtas. And of course, he's in jail, along with all the other credible voices in the media, people like Kadri Gürsel and others who could, you know, articulate the counterpoint so effectively and who have actual credibility.
So Erdogan has always been more popular than the presidential system. So he had a dilemma. People liked Erdogan, his support was high, but overall as your question indicates, if this vote was a couple years ago, opinion polls constantly showed that 60, 70% of Turks were against the presidential system. So why is it so close now? And I think the obvious answer is what happened in the last year or so. First, there was a coup attempt, which really rocked the country, and the emerging conventional wisdom narrative is that this was organized by the state within a state. So there were major purges, a major sense of trauma, which Erdogan capitalized on. It was indeed a gift from God, as he indicated the night of the coup. And he spread basically the message that the threat is still there, that the West is against us. So he galvanized nationalism. He's using basically this nationalist narrative, as it has been mentioned. And there's a major security threat to Turkey in the form of terrorism, the PKK terrorism, and of course ISIL. So all this leads to a situation where the image of Erdogan as the strong man is being basically harmonized with the image of we need a strong system, we need a strong presidential system where Erdogan is really in charge. So to me the interesting question is why he's unable to really carry even more votes. And for some of the reasons I mentioned before, but at the end of the day, I think even his own supporters, AKP supporters, have second thoughts about what would happen after Erdogan. Erdogan is not immortal. He will pass one day. And what if a secularist, a Kemalist, has the same powers one day? What if there's a day of reckoning, a day of revenge? So that's why some of the AKP supporters who would love to see Erdogan stay in power eternally are having second thoughts. MHP voters are having second thoughts for interesting reasons. They believe Erdogan may cut a deal with the Kurds, that if he becomes the president, the Sultan, as they believe, he will do what previous sultans have done, which will be to give some rights to some tribes, and he may treat the Kurds as a tribe and engage in some another peace process with the PKK. That's at least what the nationalists within the MHP are saying, to galvanize their own nationalist bloc. And I slightly disagree with Amber in the sense that CHP, the opposition, this time has struck the right chord. Devlet Kılıçdaroğlu, the leader of the CHP, is not a charismatic politician. However, he realized that if he targets Erdogan, if he personalizes this, it backfires, because Erdogan thrives on that kind of give and take. And he can basically take Kılıçdaroğlu on any day. He's more charismatic, he's more powerful. So Kılıçdaroğlu made a strategic choice of not targeting Erdogan himself. So he appears to be feckless, he appears to be ineffective, but the messaging is about the future of Turkey. Do we want a Turkey with that kind of an institutional setup? This is not about Erdogan. And I think that's one reason why Erdogan was not able to target the CHP the way he is able to, and that may pay off the day of the election, the day of the referendum.
But the question is, I agree, the CHP, I think the messaging was very effective, targeting the content of the referendum instead of targeting Erdogan personally. But the question is, of course, could he get his message across for the reasons
what
Amber said?
alternative is he offering? And I mean, his vision for Turkey, what is it exactly? He's all over the place. I mean, does he believe in giving the Kurds greater rights? I still don't know today if he believes in that or not. What is his position on, church versus state? To me, that remains unclear. I find them to be very, very fuzzy still, all over the place. It's more about trying to co-opt parts of the AK Party base, parts of the MHP base, which is why we see Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu doing the Bozkurt sign. What is that? I mean, what does the CHP stand for today? I personally don't know, but just to add to what you were saying about people questioning all of this, I think much within the AK itself, it's also very much about patronage and the fact that a lot of people, a growing number of people within the AK, feel that the spoils are being held in the hands of a very tight circle around Erdogan, and feeling disenfranchised. And in the old days, this competition was between the Gülenists and the AK, and now with the Gülenist sideline, you have new sort of rivalries emerging around these patronage networks. And I think that's something that really needs to be watched very carefully. How are municipal tenders awarded? Who do they go to? This sort of thing, I think, it can offer clues about some of the fracturing within the party network.
But there's also a segment of the AKP base who truly believes that on Sunday, if they support, if they vote yes, that Turkish democracy could thrive. And I remember watching this short documentary. They were talking to a group of AKP supporters. Before, Erdogan can always sell it as, you know, they're just, if power is centralized in my hands, then I can run this country more effectively. And I mean, to a certain point, you can buy that argument. But when it comes to what's going to happen to democracy, the AKP was mute. But now, after what happened on July 15th, he can frame it in a way, I have to be strong enough to prevent disruptions in democracy. If I'm strong enough, what happened on July 15 is not going to happen again. So that's why he's been framing it. So there is, you're right, Amberin. I think yes, there's a group, there's a network around him that really, they are profit seekers, but on the other hand, there are true believers. And I want to go back to what Kemal said and ask Amberin a question about the Kurdish question. Kemal mentioned that the key leg of the AKP strategy was trying to woo galvanize the nationalist vote, and he's been doing that since 2015. After the AKP lost the parliamentary majority in 2015, the ceasefire broke down between the PKK and the government, and in a matter of few months, in November elections, the AKP could be able to capture 50%. And part of the strategy was trying to appeal to the nationalists using the heavy-handed military approach. So in a way, yes, Turkey and Turkish democracy has many problems, but I still believe that the Kurdish question remains one of the most important issues preventing democratic consolidation in Turkey, and it has, in fact, over the years, consolidated Erdogan's power. So now, yes, his campaign strategy was to appeal to the nationalists, but we hear from his close circle that he's very unhappy with what the MHP, the ultra-nationalist party, has done, and the fact that it could not mobilize its base enough. So now Erdogan is turning to the Kurds. He was recently holding a rally in Diyarbakir, and he's hoping to capture Kurdish votes. So my question is that possible?
But
can he appeal to the Kurds?
Which Kurds, though? We need to
Yes.
be very clear, because you have the pro-PKK Kurds, let's say the Öcalan-inspired movement, to be, and then you have the conservative pious Kurds. And in the June 2015 election, Selahattin Demirtas, I think, was quite effective in bringing those conservative Kurds over to the HDP. You just said that he's turning to the Kurds. I don't really see it, because he's talking about reintroducing capital punishment. He just said that again today. I'm not sure that that really is a big, selling point with Kurds of any.
Maybe, even not with the conservative
I
Kurds?
can't imagine they'd be happy to see Abdullah Öcalan executed if that's what the, subliminal promise message is. But I think what's extremely frightening is the fact that, when you concentrate power in this way, when you do away with all checks and balances, if you put yourself in a position where you're, controlling the spigot of civil society, of everything, the only way of pushing back against this, be you a Kurd, a secularist, gay, anybody, is violence. Because you've completely done away with any avenue for peaceful dissent. And I think that is a big change and points to big risks for Turkey.
So how do you think, how will the Kurds, I mean, the conservative and the others, how will they cast their votes, or will they go to the polls? Because one fear is that they simply will stay home, and that's going to strengthen the yes camp. What is your...
I was just telling Monica that I'm so bad at predicting things, so I mean, I honestly don't know. I think Kemal Bey might know.
I see this a bit slightly differently. I'd like to look at it from a broader perspective. We've seen what's going on in the Middle East. I don't want to go into the details of it, but I think what this referendum is doing is putting in front of the Turkish public two futures. One future is a future that is based on one man, on a judiciary that loses its independence, a system that is not transparent, a system that looks increasingly like the Russian one, if not the Egyptian one, a system that emphasizes a particular identity, especially in the religious sense of the word. And I think what is significant, it's difficult to communicate this to this audience, but I highly recommend you to go back and look at the law that lays down the amendments to the Constitution. And in Turkish practice, when you're putting forward a law, there's also a preamble where you explain the reasoning behind it. And in the preamble, the chair of the Constitutional Committee of the Parliament makes references to Demirel, a former politician, to Tansu Çiller, to many others who have aspired a presidential system, which from a political student point of view makes sense. Suddenly, out of the blue, there is a reference to someone called Necip Fazıl Kısakürek, that I doubt the name means much to you. But this is a person whose name is frequently flagged by Erdogan himself. I won't go into the details. He's an Islamist thinker of the 40s, 50s, 70s, 70s. When you appreciate his vision, I think it becomes easier for me to make this observation of a Turkey that is a Turkey that is envisaged, described by this particular person. And then there is the competing Turkey, and it's very fractured. I take Amber'in Zaman's point there, but that's also a part of a broader malaise, both in this country but also in Europe, where the center is having a hard time to pull itself together and put forward a project. Now, the second project in Turkey is a little bit what I think Demirtas represents. It's a project that he put in front of the Turkish public during the spring of 2015, where he emphasized diversity along the lines that Amber'in just put it, not just ethnic diversity, but social diversity. He put women's rights in front of the Turkish public there, etc. And he won in return. I wish we weren't being recorded, because I could make references to the kind of people that have voted for him that were once committed Kemalists.
Kemal, what about the Kurds, the Kurdish vote, though?
The Kurdish vote is split along those lines.
Okay.
So there is a project that will build, that is weak, that would build on the kind of diversity, democracy, transparency I make references to, and the one that's a closed project that resembles the project from the 30s and 40s. If this constitution is adopted, we will go back to where we were in 1946. It's very ironic that the people that this president referred to as drunkards had the same powers that he will be having if this constitution is amended.
He says we're going back to 1453.
Okay,
On the Kurdish question, very briefly, there are pro-PKK Kurds in Turkey, and they're traditionally pro-AKP Kurds. And Erdogan still has hopes that the previously pro-AKP Kurds who have turned against him with the end of the peace process could be won back, because any realistic, pragmatic Kurd in the country who is not in the idealistic world of hoping that the PKK can really win the war against the AKP knows that Erdogan is there to stay, and they will have to deal with Erdogan. And Erdogan is the only politician that will be the counterpart to any Kurdish entity, Kurdish nationalist entity. So I think Erdogan hopes to convince some of the upwardly mobile, conservative Kurds who have been doing well within the last 15 years that he's still there for them, that there is still a way out of this impasse, that once he has the power that he has, there will be some sense of normalcy and a return to a dialogue with the Kurds. He has to convey this message without losing the nationalist vote and the nationalist mood of the country. So he's engaged in this high wire balance acting, but he's not given up on the non-PKK Kurdish vote, as we have seen in the rally in Diyarbakir.
So that is, there's no obvious evidence that he even cares about those non-PKK Kurds. Look at the cabinet, the ministers. How many Kurds are there today? Look at his inner circle, all the advisors, etc.
It's about
There's
terrorism.
not a single...
He cares about terrorism. He knows that continuing on this path will create more PKK terrorism, and more terrorism will impact the economy and everything. So he has to go back to some sense of normalcy sooner or later.
But I'm trying to say is, how does he convince the non-PKK Kurds that he's sincere, that he has something to offer to them?
He'll be
when
empowered.
Sorry?
He's the only one in power that can do these things. So who else? If you vote against him, what do you vote for?
Well, local AK, I mean, he hasn't mentioned returning to the peace process once, even in his Diyarbakir rally. So that hasn't been that hasn't been part of his campaign promise. But local AKP officials, that's what I hear from people on the ground, that they've been quietly talking about that. So if Erdogan wins, there is a possibility that we can actually go back to the negotiations. That, of course, would that have any appeal? Can he convince anyone among the Kurds? And that is the question. And instead, I think he's mostly focusing on, we'll rebuild the cities. He first destroyed them, and now he's promising to rebuild those Kurdish cities. So that could be without really touching on the ethnic sensitivities and identities. So he's pursuing a more center-right approach to the Kurdish question.
Rebuilding cities again speaks to the whole patronage issue.
Bread and butter, yeah.
So you sort of disperse those contracts among some AKP-friendly or potentially AK-friendly Kurds. That's certainly a way forward. But of course, it doesn't address any of the structural underlying problems. Of the Kurdish problem. And if he, and it seems very clear to me that his thinking is that he will not go back to negotiations with the PKK or with Öcalan unless he can get Öcalan to make, the kinds of concessions that fully chime with what his vision of a solution is. And of course, Öcalan won't go for that. He didn't go for that, which is why the peace process collapsed. And I think he'll sort of do the Putin thing, as Putin in Chechnya did, putting in his own sort of. Yeah, I mean, I hope we don't go there. It doesn't quite look like Chechnya, God forbid. But I mean, the thinking, I think, is not too different.
Well, I have.
The economic dimension there is critical.
Yeah, we'll come to that.
But the two are closely engaged. Amberin has a point. Rebuilding. How are you going to rebuild before having peace? And who are you going to rebuild it? Diyarbakir, Kahramanmaraş, that region did well, exploded. You only refer to Kayseri and Konya. In the years 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It exploded at a time when democracy was doing well, rule of law was doing well, there was competition, so much that investors, Kurdish and non-Kurdish, from Istanbul and western parts of the country were prepared to go and invest there and reap the benefits of it for the Kurdish people, but also the country. That's not where we are.
I mean, the question was, yes, what he's offering might not really solve the Kurdish question, but what I was asking was the messaging that, the message that he's trying to deliver in the Kurdish region, that might have some appeal. That's what I'm trying to say. And in fact, he might, if he wins, because he knows that the status quo is not sustainable, if he wins, he's a pragmatic leader. He could actually go back to the negotiations. But let's leave it there, because I know I want to have enough time for the Q&A. And I want to ask you, Kemal, about the secret. So Erdogan keeps winning elections, and many people here ask, what is the secret? And it's the economy. Turkey has achieved sustainable economic growth under his rule. But considering the instability in Turkey, bombs exploding everywhere, less foreign direct investment as a result, and tense relations with its important trade partners, so many people think that he will have a bumpier ride ahead. So what is your take on that? What is the state of Turkish economy? But very briefly, so that we have enough time.
I like the emphasis on brief, when it comes to me especially. The economy is critical from my point of view. Every single survey that's run in Turkey shows that the Turkish electorate, like here, cares for the economy. The last year and a half has been exceptional. He's fortunate because miraculously the Turkish economy is still resilient. The world economy grew by 3% in 2016. Europe grew by 1.9%, the US by 1.6%. And the kind of country that Gönül just described, with bombs going off here and there, coup d'etats, etc., it managed to grow by 2.9%. So it's resilient. But economists, and most recently the IMF, flag out that there are serious problems. One serious problem, which I think in itself is extremely telling, that the Turkish Statistical Institute last year introduced a new way of measuring Turkey's GDP and its growth. And on the basis of that, the Turkish economy, on the basis of that formula, now is $850 billion of size. But to the World Bank, it's $717 billion. So that's a problem we need to bear in mind, and will complicate for those who want to invest, those who want to study the Turkish economy, to really know what's happening to the Turkish economy. But it still has strong fundamentals. Its public debt is very small. The US debt overall, private and public, is 115% of its GDP. Turkey's is 47%, and the public debt is only 21%. And that partly also explains how comfortable Erdogan can be with his finances and what he does. Yet, on the other hand, what is driving the Turkish economy to perform at the level that it is, it's private consumption, which is understandable with the referendum coming up, and then also huge construction projects. Huge construction projects. Amberin made references at the municipal level, but there are much bigger construction projects that are plagued by all the kinds of problems that references was made to. Let me just to give you an idea. For example, the bridge across the Izmit Gulf there. The price for it had to be reduced so that people could use it. But because it's a public-private partnership, the Turkish government, has promised to pay for the difference. 40,000 vehicles are supposed to pass a day over this bridge, and only 12,000 are passing. Because when it was first calculated, the growth rate was assumed to be 5%. Now it's at 2.9%. The difference is being paid out on a daily basis by the Treasury. This is flagged out as a serious problem. A second serious problem is the savings problem. So as he goes to the referendum, he may be calculating how am I going to win the hearts and minds of Kurds. But what he has to also calculate is that Kayseri and Konya are two cities that in 2016 have seen their exports collapsing. So he has to build a project, an economic project, and if I'm not mistaken, we hear nothing about it as far as the referendum goes. I believe if Ömer's scenario happens, Ömer's scenario is going to happen more because of economic considerations rather than other issues.
Do you agree with that?
There's a clear correlation between consumer confidence and the electoral performance of AKP. In the last 15 years, the only time the AKP scored, other than 2002 when they came to power, below 40% was in 2008.
Closer to your mic, please.
Was in 2008 when there were recessionary dynamics and unemployment was ticking up. So if there is a slowdown of the economy, and there is a slowdown of the economy, if there is growing inflation, and there is growing inflation now, if people don't feel confident about the future of the country, this has a huge impact on the way they vote. That's why this election comes at a critical time in terms of where the economy is. Public debt, as Kemal said, is low. Private debt is very high. The Turkish private sector is very highly indebted and in short term, and the depreciation of the Turkish currency is alarming for most of the private sector investors. And in that sense, this election does not come at a very opportune time for the AKP, for Erdogan, and he may pay a price given the slowdown of the economy and the consumer confidence dropping. And if 2008 is an example, in 2008 local elections, he got 39% of the vote. 2009 local elections, he received 39% of the vote.
If you don't have anything to add.
Of course, is a very big thing, and that's gone down the drain, and doesn't seem to be looking up. But in terms of just very quickly, why is he so successful? Well, he's an incredibly convincing orator. You know, just last night I was trying to get myself to fall asleep, and I was, you know, surfing the internet and watched a video of him speaking at a rally. And I have to admit, I was, you know, mesmerized.
Were you able to sleep?
No, I wanted to listen. He's incredibly captivating, convincing. And if for a moment you can forget all the bad things that happened, you know, we mustn't disregard that.
I hope you voted before that video. Okay, so now I want to continue with Ömer on, I know many people are here in this town, in this room, are wondering about different scenarios. What would happen to Turkey's relations with the West? Turkey has been having a very difficult relationship with the West, with the US over Syria and the Kurds, with Europe. Recently, Erdogan attacked the Dutch government as Nazi remnants. I mean, I understand maybe with the US, the problems might be real, but with Europe, how much of it is real and how much of it is gonna change after the referendum, and also what would happen under different scenarios?
It is very real. With both the European Union and with the US, the Turkey's resentment, frustration, public opinion frustration is very real. And for obvious reasons, the United States, under new management, has not changed its policy vis-à-vis the Kurds. The operation to Raqqa will be organized, undertaken with the PYD, the Kurdish group in Syria. The United States is already working with the PYD. It's not very much publicized in Turkey, and the US press is not really talking about about it, but it's clear. That's why Tillerson had an awful meeting with Çavuşoğlu in Ankara, where there was apparently a frank and candid conversation. And in that sense, the United States policy with the Kurds is creating really a major problem for Turkey's relations with the West. The Kurdish question is the litmus test for everything in Turkish foreign policy. If you're in bed with the PKK, and the PYD in the eyes of the Turkish public and the Turkish system is the PKK, you're basically in bed with a terrorist organization that wants to destroy Turkey. That's how the majority of the Turkish public sees it. So the Kurdish question with the US has become really a structural problem now. With the EU, similar dynamics are at play. I mean, you have a very active Kurdish diaspora in Europe, and you have a rise of nativism, Islamophobia, populism in Europe, and we have seen how difficult things can be in the Dutch elections when Turkish politicians wanted to campaign in Holland, and the Dutch politicians basically said no because of domestic reasons in Holland. So similar dynamics were at play in Germany. More fundamentally, I don't think the Turkey-EU relations are going anywhere. I'm not optimistic about a solution in Cyprus. I'm not optimistic about European public opinion embracing Turkey. Turkey becoming more authoritarian and nationalistic, especially if the referendum passes, I think it will be very difficult to put Turkey-EU relations back on track. Another layer of frustration in Turkey, which creates nationalism, is the presence of Fethullah Gülen in the United States. For what it's worth, the Turkish public and the Turkish system is convinced that Fethullah Gülen was behind the coup. And in the eyes of the Turkish public and in the eyes of the Turkish system, the United States is not cooperating. And the argument that there is no evidence that he is himself involved in the coup does not really convince the Turkish public. Turkey has a very notoriously conspiratorial media and public opinion, and people believe that there is a link between the CIA and Fethullah Gülen, the American deep state, and Fethullah Gülen. And in that sense, Erdogan is playing that card too. So not only you have the Kurdish problem that creates tremendous amount of anti-Americanism, now you have the Gülen issue that polarizes Turkey's relations with the United States. So under such circumstances, what Erdogan is doing, he's basically increasingly showing signs of rapprochement with Russia. And missile defense is the litmus test. If Turkey buys Russian missile defense, that would send a strong signal to NATO, the only club where Turkey has a solid membership. And I just came back from Brussels. We had several meetings with NATO officials. They're optimistic that Turkey is just bluffing, that Turkey has done the same thing while it was negotiating with China for missile defense, that at the end of the day, Turkey did not buy Chinese missile defense. But they're also concerned. And if indeed Turkey buys Russian missile defense, this will send a strong signal to the West that there's something structurally changing in the Turkish military system. Given the coup and its aftermath, I should add as a final point that the profile of officers who are left in the Turkish army are very, very Eurasianist, very nationalist, very anti-NATO, anti-US. So the training that the US military used to get from NATO, from the US, I mean, it's very hard to continue these things when you basically have this belief that the United States was involved with the Gülen movement. And there is so much resentment in the Turkish army now against the West that one anchor that used to be pro-Western, the Turkish military, is a question mark at this point in terms of how much they are willing to continue things as business as usual with the United States. So there is this Eurasianist mood in Turkey within the army as well, which is something to take note of.
But also with EU, I believe that if he wins on Sunday, he could tone down his rhetoric. Because you have to admit that what he did with Germany, with the Netherlands, it was brilliant, because he could be able to mobilize those marginalized Turkish immigrants. and the turnout we hear is incredibly high, higher than ever. And there was a public opinion poll that says that he could be able to capture nationalist votes after the tension between Turkey and the EU. So he could change.
The problem, however, is not that, it's just that not the tone. The tone may change. He may not engage in that much anti-EU narrative, but there are structural problems in Turkey-EU relations. And even the refugee deal that created this hope for visa liberalization, given the coup in Turkey, the emergency law, the lack of basically rule of law, democracy, minority rights, there are such deeply rooted structural problems in the Turkey-EU relations that I don't see things really going back to where they were in 2005.
So I want to turn, if you don't have anything to add, I want to turn to the audience, and Kemal is, oh, sorry, Amberin, go ahead. Yes.
I think that relations with Turkey have become a very big domestic issue in the EU, so you have to consider that too when, you know, you have all these elections ahead of us, and that will have an impact. But in terms of relations with Russia, I think the whole thing is very ad hoc and very much driven by what's happening in Syria and the manner in which Turkey, you know, so enthusiastically embraced the airstrikes. You know, suggests that, you know, it would be willing to sort of turn its back on Russia at the, you know, flip of a hat.
Sure, if you want to answer
On
questions,
Russia,
because I know
on
you'll
Russia,
be
the kinds of officers that Ömer is making references also know that in January, Russia cold-bloodedly killed 3 Turkish soldiers and wounded 11 in Elbab. And the Turkish military knows that. And when you put it together with what Amberin has just said, and you read The Economist warning Turkey not to hit the sack with Russia, I think that's not an avenue that is a very viable avenue in terms of addressing Turkey's national security issue. Very quickly, I agree with all that is said about the European Union. But on both sides, on the side of the European Union and on the side of Turkey, there are realists that know that economically the two sides need each other. Turkey is the 6th largest trading partner of the European Union, and the EU is the largest one for Turkey. They are tied to each other in a very uncomfortable way. And when bread and butter counts, there is nowhere else to go than the European Union there.
So I want to open the floor for questions, but Kemal has to leave early. So if you have questions on economy, please ask them first and identify yourselves. David Mack and the gentleman.
Yes, David Mack, Middle East Institute. It seems to me, without knowing a lot about Turkish politics, that Erdogan's timing is very good. And based on what you've said, I think you can sort of summarize his campaign as make Turkey great again, and I alone can do it. I mean, that's a great theory you have, Omar, but I don't know how you're going to overcome the advantage that he seems to have with the kind of voters that Amberlin pointed out. Yeah, Amber. Okay.
What's wrong with that?
These people who are going to vote on these bread and butter issues are going to ignore the constitutional losses that will take place with a yes vote. Am I wrong?
Okay, let's take one more question. There is a question, the gentleman in the back.
Thank you. 2 quick questions. So first, how do you...
One.
How do you explain the long-lasting absence of non-Islamist Turks? Is it the lack of freedom of speech and lack of freedoms in general, or is Erdogan appealing to those people?
Okay. Well, you want to start? Who wants to take the last question?
I'll take the last question about the long absence, as you put it, of non-Islamist Turks. I think we tend to...
Turks. Turks.
Non-Islamist Turks,
Yes.
right? Okay. So Kemalists, basically, the secular Turks. I think in Washington and in Europe, we overemphasize in Turkey the divide between Islam and secularism. We tend to see Erdogan as an Islamist, and we tend to see basically the other group as secularists, and they disagree basically about the role of Islam, the role of religion in governance. I tend to say this was to a certain degree true, but increasingly what we see in Turkey is another cleavage that is emerging, and that's the one between democracy and authoritarianism. It's no longer Islam and secularism. And overall, Erdogan is portrayed now in the Western media more accurately, not just as an Islamist, but more of an autocrat. And he has made peace with secularism to a certain degree, and secularists have made peace with Erdogan. And the key to that alliance between basically religious conservatives and secularists is the common denominator that they have, and that's in one word, nationalism. Islamists and secularists, religious conservatives and progressives, if there's one thing that they agree in Turkey is nationalism. And that's why the Kurdish question is very important. That's why relations with the West, the EU, United States is very important. Erdogan, especially in the aftermath of the 15th of July, has portrayed basically the Gülen movement as made in the USA. This is an imperialist coup, and he portrays the Kurdish conflict as the West is trying to divide Turkey, and this is a brilliant strategy in terms of galvanizing the nationalist vote. In that sense, the absence of non-Islamist Turks can be explained by the rising nationalism of Turkey.
You want to add
On
anything?
great again, Turkey was genuinely great when in April 2009 the previous president of the United States paid a visit in Ankara, addressed the Turkish parliament, received a standing ovation for talking about Turkey as setting a precedent. He didn't want to use the word model, reference. And I think the public at large has a sense for it. I mean, Amberin mentioned tourism. In 2014, 35 million foreign nationals came to Turkey. Last year, it was 21 million. And that's very visible. And that links to greatness. I think it's a challenge for him to be able to go back to where Turkey was in 2009, 2010. And all that relates to many of the questions that have been addressed here.
If I may add one thing about make Turkey great again, it's hard for Erdogan to say this because he's been running the country for 15 years. So, I mean, he's campaigning on how great the AKP was, how great the AKP is on bread and butter issues. Then he's saying, in order to have an effective government, we need the presidential system. Well, how did you do all these great things without a presidential system? So that's where the lack of credibility comes in.
Okay, well, Kemal has to leave, and thank you so much.
Sorry.
You forgot your hat.
I need it in the sunlight.
Okay, there's a question in the back, and one here.
Break the mic? No. Hi there, Ishan Thurur, The Washington Post. Apologies, I came in a little bit late, so I may have missed this part of the conversation, but I was wondering in your conversations with AK Party officials or people closer to the ground, or people within the yes camp, is there any kind of reckoning with this question of checks and balances, with this question of what democratic consolidation looks like? Do they have their own parallel argument about what that looks like? Incorporating some of the Western, quote-unquote, Western concerns about what makes a democracy strong? And if I could tack on a very quick second question to play devil's advocate, say Erdogan wins, is there an argument or a speculative argument that suggests now that he has consolidated the power that he has, now that he feels safe, that Turkey's posture could radically soften or change vis-a-vis its neighbors, vis-a-vis the West?
Okay, there's one more, and Aaron, so let's take three.
Hi, Leslie Dutton. Let's just say that the no vote ends up being successful. What are the chances that they can actually consolidate that into being a hard no on the eventuality of a presidential system? Or is it just kicking the can down the road until the next time that the president can, get a majority to try to push it through Parliament? Do you think it could be a hard no, or is it really just no for now again?
And one more question here.
Aaron Stein, Atlantic Council. Is there a possibility with the new coalition, if he does get yes, that this is the AKP we should expect into 2017 into 2019, meaning that he got over the threshold with MHP votes, and therefore his biggest political liability as he begins to kick off his campaign again to restart the two 5-year term limits will be he's too soft on the Kurds?
I want to start with your question. If there is a no vote, can it sort of consolidate into a hard no? And I think it very much depends on how big that no vote is. Because after all, even if there is a no vote, Erdogan will still be the president and the AKP will still be running the country. And if it's not a very big margin, he could very easily hold fresh elections and push the HDP and the MHP under the barrage and get his way again, and have Parliament do the job for him if he has a strong enough majority, which he clearly will. But even if there is a yes, I think he still may choose to hold elections just to, further consolidate his position. And that speaks to some extent to what Ishan just asked about. Will he change tack? Will this newly empowered will this make him more magnanimous? And I think, first of all, on the Kurdish issue, the answer is no. I don't think he's going to go back, as I said earlier in my comments, that I don't think he's going to go back to talking to the PKK or to Abdullah Öcalan. And let's not forget that Turkey's Kurdish problem is no longer confined to its own borders. What's happening in Rojava in northern Syria, I think, plays a very central part in how the Kurdish question is framed and how the government responds to it. And I think increasingly we'll see a dynamic where the government will find ways of using its military presence in northern Syria to put further pressure on the PKK, which allows it, of course, to sort of get the PKK to de-escalate militarily in Turkey. Why? Because for as long as the YPG is in alliance with the United States, it can ill afford, the PKK now understands this, it can ill afford to have images of Turkish civilians killed in PKK attacks broadcast on Turkish television, because it makes it very difficult that in turn for the United States to continue justifying its alliance with the PKK, the YPG, however much it continues to insist that the two are separate.
Well, let me just, before you do, jump in here, because I disagree with Amberin. I think, and it might sound counterintuitive, but I think if he wins, things might get back to normal in terms of, so he's been fighting with the West, and he's been pursuing this nationalist strategy domestically, mainly to attract nationalist votes. So if he wins again, I don't think he'll call for early elections, because even the AKP electorate, they're tired of, Turkey has been in an endless election cycle, and the AKP electorate is tired of elections. So I don't think if he wins on Sunday, he's going to call for early elections, which means that he's not going to need that nationalist coalition anymore. And I think deep down, he has to understand this. He's a very pragmatic guy. He has to understand that the status quo is not sustainable. So he has to do something on the Kurdish question. And that's, you're right. I mean, the Turkey's Kurdish problem is not confined to Turkey anymore. It's, in a way, it never has been. And that's precisely why Erdogan might want to go back to the negotiations, because he's kind of cornered in Syria. He's not going to change the US calculations. He's not going to change Russian policy. So at the end, he'll have to admit that he'll have to work with the PYD. And for that, if you're fighting against the PKK domestically, how are you going to find room to maneuver in Syria? So I think that's why at some point he'll go back to the negotiations.
But I think it will also be very much a function of what the Trump administration decides for Syria. If we see greater U.S. involvement in ways that meet Turkey's demands in Syria, establishing safe zones, etc., that may alter the balance in Syria in ways that may work to the disadvantage of the YPG, for instance. We really don't know. It's a very fluid situation.
No, it is, but I feel like it's really, as long as there's ISIS and as long as the U.S. is reluctant to put boots on the ground, and as long as the Arab opposition is divided, I think the PYD will remain the key to the fight against ISIS, so the US will keep working with the PYD. And Russia too, I mean, Turkey cultivated closer ties, hoping that they might, that Turkey might shift dynamics on the ground, by working closer with Russia. Ankara might convince the Russians to dump the Kurds, and that hasn't really happened. It's not realistic. So that's why I think, especially in Syria, Turkey is very marginalized. And even after months of military operation, I mean, Turkey launched this military incursion into Syria to be a player at the table. Having boots on the ground, having a military presence in Syria would, Ankara hope, make Turkey a player again. So that was the calculation. And yet that hasn't happened. And the declared goal was, well, after Al-Bab, we'll go to Manbij, we'll capture Manbij. This operation is never going to end without capturing Manbij. That was the statements we were hearing from the government. That hasn't happened, and yet Turkey decided to end its military operation. Why? Because it had to. Well, there was no room to maneuver, so that's why I think Turkey doesn't have many options in Syria. I don't foresee a dramatic shift in U.S. policy, especially vis-a-vis the Kurds in Syria. So,
but here's the thing. First of all, Turkey, I think, has an infinite capacity to be quite disruptive in Syria. Second, for as long as the alliance continues between the YPG and the United States, the price for that sadly seems to be silence on all the human rights abuse inside Turkey. When Tillerson went to Ankara, he didn't utter a single word about what was going on in the southeast, even though the United Nations just came out with an extremely damning report of what was going on there. And so it seems that, the price of continued partnership with the Kurds in Syria means keeping silent about the plight of the Kurds in Turkey, which allows Erdogan to continue with his policies vis-a-vis the Kurds. I don't see there being any real impetus leverage brought to bear on him to change, whether or not regardless of whether he needs nationalists or not.
If I may add something about U.S. policy towards the Kurds, this cooperation with the YPG is...
Speak up.
This cooperation with the YPG is hard to explain to Ankara, and Ankara is very angry. But I think one talking point that the U.S. administration has in explaining this cooperation with the PYD is that this creates leverage with the Kurdish movement in general in Turkey, and that there has to be a return to some sense of dialogue with the PKK down the line. And in that sense, the U.S. could put pressure on Kandil, on the PKK, to demilitarize in Turkey in return for basically continuing to fight ISIL in Syria, in return for basically putting some of the arms, transitioning some of the guerrillas to Syria, and that could prove to the Turkish government that the U.S. has indeed leverage. That would be the credibility test for the United States. But what I hear when I talk to officials is that it's better for us to have leverage over the Kurds than others, and we can help Turkey down the line And the normalization of Turkey requires a peace process. The only way democracy can improve in Turkey is with a peace process. Our ultimate goal is to help Turkey with the peace process. This requires, we understand, the PKK to demilitarize, and we can help with that as long as we have leverage with the Kurds in Syria. This would be a moment of reckoning for the Kurdish movement also. What is more important for a young Kurd in the region? To have basically a quasi-independent state in Syria, where the PKK is very active, or to have a modicum of cultural rights and some federalism, decentralization in Turkey? And I think for hardcore Kurdish activists, nationalists, Rojava is more important than potential federalism in Turkey. So they could basically transfer the fight to Syria and engage in a peace process with Turkey and hope that Turkey can compartmentalize the peace at home with the PKK and what's going on in Syria, where Syria may be a lost case, where the Kurds establish a regional government as they have in Iraq, but this time it will be under a PKK. On your question, Ishan, about whether there are AKP doubters, whether there's a debate within the AKP about checks and balances, I think for some AKP voters, more than checks and balances about the presidential system, as I mentioned earlier, maybe you weren't here, the fear is that this presidential system will continue after Erdogan. What if there is a Kemalist? What if there is a secularist that wins the election and engages in a kind of authoritarian, secular drive against political Islam? So this gives too much power to one man, and in that sense, I hear some of the AKP voters saying Erdogan, his appetite has no end. It's always more, and one day he will pass, and he's not immortal. And what's going to happen once you have such centralization of power in the country?
I just want to say that I slightly disagree with you, Omar, about the Kurds. I think in the Kurdish imagination, those borders between Turkey and northern Syria have completely evaporated, and they've raised the stakes. I don't think they see it anymore as a choice. It's not a binary choice between do we get more in Turkey versus less in Rojava or the other way around. I think.
But there is a border.
Well, but in the Kurdish imagination, I think it's been blurred. And I think for as long as the United States' primary goal in Syria is to defeat ISIS, they're not going to put their relationship with the YPG PKK at risk by seeming to sort of be promoting Turkey's demands or getting into a kind of situation where they're perceived to be doing that. Certainly not at this juncture. And I think the fact that they haven't even convinced the PKK to leave Sinjar is an indication of how far they're willing to put pressure on the PKK at this stage.
Let's take two more questions here and there.
Good afternoon. Pascal Siegel from Ankara Consulting. Let's say the no wins Sunday. What does Erdogan do?
Hi, Shireen Yassin from Middle East Broadcasting Network. Would the European Union prefer to negotiate with Erdogan if the referendum is a yes at the end? Would the EU prefer to negotiate with a strong Erdogan or with a weak Erdogan?
Well, whenever Erdogan loses, which hasn't happened very often, as Omar said, he tends to disappear. We don't hear from him for a while. We don't see him.
But he comes back with a vengeance.
He comes back with a plan. So, as I said, depending on the extent of the margin, he may well, gamble again and do a new election. And in terms of how the Europeans respond, I think that for as long as certainly Angela Merkel's priority remains keeping Syrians out of Europe, they would clearly want to be dealing with somebody who's strong enough to, keep that bargain on the table and enforced?
If the no wins, here's the optimistic scenario. Erdogan disappears for a while, tries to understand what went wrong. In the meantime, the MHP explodes. You have basically a situation where Devlet Bahçeli is no longer able to control the party. And as Erdogan thinks about the next step, which to me will be a repeat of 2015 June, when he was defeated, as he ponders, he will probably go for another election. He will try to call early elections, and he will try to give another shot to this presidential system. He desperately wants the presidential system. We haven't talked about why he desperately wants the presidential system. To me, it's in no small part because he needs lifetime immunity from corruption investigations. He desperately needs that, and he will try again. But as he tries again, here's the good scenario. He will not be able to forge a strong coalition with the MHP because the MHP will implode. And the MHP implosion may create room in the right in Turkey, in the center right, for the likes of Bülent Arınç, Abdullah Gül to make an entry to Turkish politics with an alternative to AKP. It could be the MHP, it could be Meral Akşener, who is the dissident within the MHP, starting a new political party, others joining it. But there will be room in the Turkish conservative right for a new formation if there is a no. And that could spell trouble for Erdogan in terms of winning elections, business as usual, given the state of the economy. So that's my optimistic scenario. In addition to the no, sending a very strong message to the world that Turkish civil society, despite all these pressures, despite this state of emergency, is still alive and can say no, it's still resilient. It can create momentum for a new party and the disgruntled AKP leaders like Abdullah Gül, Bülent Arınç to join that new party and bring new life to Turkish right-wing politics. About the EU, I think the EU does not really care if Erdogan loses or wins. I mean, they basically have decided that they will have to deal with Erdogan for the foreseeable future. If Turkey makes serious reforms under this good scenario that I talked about, if somehow Turkey manages to once again prioritize democratization, a solution to the Kurdish conflict, that may not be a very good thing for Europe because they will have to figure out new reasons to say no to Turkey. The EU does not want Turkey, period. The mood in the EU is enlargement has created troubles. We don't want another country. The EU is in crisis with Brexit. I don't think they want to deal with Turkey. With Erdogan, they have an excuse, a legitimate excuse to say no. With a Turkey without Erdogan moving in the right direction, they will have to make up new excuses.
Well, I think we'll end today's discussion there. Thank you all for coming, and we'll be posting the podcast, so please check back our website. Thank you.